Oh my God, why is it so bright?
I feel kind of far away from you guys, but
Yeah.
We can all move in onto the couch.
You want to go on the couch?
it's okay.
Sure, yeah. That's the minimum.
It's going to be a little awkward.
Actually, it's better if we
Yeah.
stay in order for them, I think.
All right.
Yeah,
So,
Sure.
we're all good.
I hope we don't
Yeah.
mess up the camera people. Sorry.
I think
They
they're
framed
okay.
the shot with that last chair in mind, so.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Ben. I'm host of the BTC Sessions on YouTube. I guess I'll just let you guys introduce yourselves. We'll start with Paul.
Sure, my name is Paul Stortz. We're going to be talking about Softforks today, so I have a Softfork proposal, BIP 300. I've also written a lot about Softforks in the past, so I guess that's my intro.
Awesome. Jimmy.
I'm a Bitcoin expert, I guess, or educator or something. I do a lot of stuff in Bitcoin. I write lots of books, and yeah, I'm up here mostly to look pretty, I think.
Hey, I'm Jeremy Rubin. I'm a Bitcoin Core rabble-rouser, and I also have a Softfork proposal that I've been doing called BIP 119, and happy to be here to talk about it with y'all.
Awesome. Welcome, guys. Let's give them a round of applause for being here. And so I want to start this talk out by making it accessible to some people that may not be super familiar. So we'll just set a few baseline things, then we'll get into the weeds after that. So I'll open this up to anybody here, but let's just break down really quickly, briefly, the difference between a hard and soft fork for whoever wants to take what I've just teed up.
I will do it because a fork is a very serious thing. It is really how the protocol changes from one protocol to a different protocol, which can cause people a little bit of consternation because they worry about, oh, am I going to lose the things I really like about the old protocol? And that is the difference between the hard and soft fork, which is that the hard fork is an absolute permanent split where you form two networks and you break up and you are never getting back together. And then with the soft fork, there's this theoretical compatibility where these different protocols are nonetheless interoperable with each other. So you can stay, this idea of it being compatible and opt-in, which is a nuanced point, but the idea of the old node, you can stay there, you can stay with the old protocol, and that's what makes it soft. And I could talk more about that if you want, but I'm sure you can.
I would say that soft forks are backwards compatible, hard forks are not backwards compatible. And the idea of a fork is that you have two blockchains or two ledgers that have some difference. And that is terrible for any sort of consensus mechanism because they're not in consensus. And that's what we want to avoid generally. And soft fork or hard fork, that's, unless you are permanently wanting to split like Bitcoin Cash did.
And what precedent does that set for for the user, like in terms of a soft fork versus a hard fork? If you're a user, you're perhaps running a Bitcoin node, for instance, what responsibilities do you or don't you have in a soft fork versus a hard fork? What do you have to do?
So I'll jump in there and just kind of, with a more contrarian take, riding off of this and tell people what their responsibilities actually are. But ultimately, like, they're not really so different. Like, both of them can result to a bad thing happening to your Bitcoin. And so from that perspective, they're the same. And I think ultimately what it comes down to is how do you participate? And the choice of the soft fork is really something that allows people who are just kind of disinterested in what's happening with development and disinterested in upgrading or whatever to just like continue to be a part of the network. The downside of that is that like changes can happen to the Bitcoin network even if you're not participating. So in some senses, soft forks are maybe bad because how do you oppose something that can happen if you're just not even aware that it's happening? And then hard forks, on the other hand, it's like, well, if you don't want it to happen and the rest of the network does it, now you're off the network permanently, and that's like not really great. But on the other hand, for a hard fork, you'd have to have like much more overwhelming consensus to make it happen. So each of them have trade-offs, and ultimately like the end negative outcome is the same, which is that like a bad thing could happen to you, but we get to choose the trade-offs. And right now, in the community, the dominant choice is that people prefer seemingly soft forks, but that is a preference. It's not like a mathematical proof that one is superior to the other.
Let's go a bit deeper into that.
Yes, a very important point.
Yeah, so what precedent does it set, given that Bitcoin leans heavily, the community has leaned heavily towards keeping things backwards compatible versus protocols that have gone off and basically have regular hard forks? what do we lose by normalizing regular hard forks versus what has been preserved with Bitcoin?
Well, the main problem with hard forks is that you're forcing essentially everybody to upgrade. And if they don't upgrade, then they're no longer part of the consensus. And who's doing the forcing, right? If you're being forced by some central entity, then you're clearly centralized because whoever made that hard fork is demanding it of you. This is how Ethereum works. They demand you to upgrade. If you don't upgrade, then you're no longer part of the consensus and your blockchain is essentially invalid. Whereas if you are part of the new, hard fork the software that they tell you to run, then you're part of that consensus, in which case it's not really consensus as much as it is somebody from authority telling you what you have to run in order to be compatible with the rest of the network. So hard forks for me are centralized, and it's an indication of centralization, at least the way they've been used. So for coins to go do that, it reveals their centralized single point of failure. Whereas, with a soft fork, what you have is this ability to be backwards compatible. You're not forcing anything on anybody. Hard forks, like almost all rules are up for grabs, including the supply limit and stuff like that, which I find an anathema. Like part of what you have that's very valuable about Bitcoin is that certain things aren't going to change because of the way, because it's backwards compatible and it enforces the rules that you all know, including 21 million, right? Like that's sacred.
But of course, he just said that, but Jeremy just said that soft and hard forks really aren't that different. So I'd like to and you're saying they're very, very different, of course. And I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but we have to now maybe unpack this for the audience because this is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, because this, as I said, the fork is a very serious matter of changing the protocol. And it was thought that, first of all, the soft fork is clearly, it's not only backwards but forwards compatible. All the nodes share the same network. And it used to be thought that because they were all compatible, you can just stay where you were, and therefore the opt-in property came from the compatibility property. But it was later, there were a couple sort of chinks in the armor of that argument where Peter Todd proposed the evil fork idea where you can change lots of things with the soft fork. And then SegWit actually increased the block size with a soft fork, which was sort of it was something that everyone had to experience. There's another case actually that I think is a very good example, which is the S-value signature case where that is something that is very, very soft. And the very old definition of the soft fork was that if you got miners on your side, anytime the two different blocks were mined following incompatible rules, since the miners always went with one, everyone would end up going along. That was the old definition of the soft fork. So this S-value situation is where an example of something where it was 100% soft, but it was 0% opt-in. A normal layperson had no choice but to upgrade their software. They could not send money.
Yeah, I think to break that down,
Yes.
a similar thing to this would be like if we decided P2SH was bad and then just said no more spending P2SH addresses. Like that would be a soft fork, possibly, and that would be confiscatory and that would steal people's money and that would be bad. And I think overall it's one of these things where for hard forks, I think it's like there is a propensity to shove it down people's throat. But it's more of a cultural value for what type of activity we want to do. And soft forks generally align more with things we want to be more opt-in. But you could do either. An example of this would be we could use all the same BIP9 version bits. We can talk about what those are, and speedy trial, and we could have a delayed activation that would be like 2 years in the future for a hard fork. And that would probably be pretty good in terms of not being something where we just the devs decided there's a hard fork happening, but it still would be that old nodes at that 2-year mark would fall off. There have been proposals previously, like somebody said, Bitcoin Core should, I think Luke Jr. made this point, Bitcoin Core should just have a fixed number of block headers it can consume by default, and so it shuts off in 10 years. So all nodes just have a shelf life, and now every hard fork is a soft fork based on if you're running Bitcoin Core, because we could deploy it and then the node automatically shuts off after some fixed deadline. It's like, well, I don't love that, but like, yeah, you can kind of map
don't
these
love that
things
either.
one onto the other.
But I normally
and
love
ultimately,
loop,
I think the thing that, to wrap it up into a coherent point is hard or soft, like, feature or whatever, what matters is that we do these things in a way that involves mass participation and consent of the, I don't want to say the word governed, but that's the phrase, consent of the ungoverned.
No, it's a good phrase.
I would say that you can do evil things with a soft fork. I think that's the point that you're making. Of course you can do that. You can eliminate SegWit, you can eliminate all kinds of things by saying these are no longer allowed on the network. I don't think we're denying that. The real question, I think, in your sort of equivalence of hard fork and soft fork is that, okay, is it possible to have sort of like a benevolent hard fork? I suppose in some metaphysical way it can be somewhat benevolent, but I think what we're saying is with soft forks, at least the ones that Bitcoin has done, it's generally benevolent soft forks, not the evil soft forks. I think that you're talking about like eliminating pay to script hash or something like that. And those are the ones that, it's within the space of soft forks that I think benevolent or good things for the network are, because once you change sort of like permanent rules or anything like that, that opens up a whole like can of worms that I don't think we want to go down. So for me, like soft forks are very important to like stay within that area of soft forks and not, and obviously avoid the evil soft forks, but go with this sort of subset that's actually benevolent.
Let's go back historically in terms of, Paul, when I was speaking to you over email prior to this, you made reference to, it's a question of is it worth it in the instance of a hard fork? And we saw historically, like for 2017, when there's this push to go from 1 megabyte to 2 megabytes, I mean, the resounding answer from a lot of individuals was no, we don't want to set the precedent of changing for small incremental increases in block size like that. But Bitcoin has hard forked before, so I'm wondering if somebody wants to maybe touch on when it was.
I'm not sure that it ever intentionally has, because the only two that it's kind of like 1.5. Mm-hmm. One was when Satoshi added the op-nops in 2010 or something, and he's the creator, so he sort of, it's like creator's right or whatever. It like doesn't really make, it's not really a very relevant consideration, right, since he created it in the first place. And then the other one was after the summer 2015 database lock situation. I'm not exactly sure what to call that, but there was something where a database configuration rule had become a consensus rule without anyone knowing, and then it had been changed. And so it is possible to sync old nodes, but you have to do this extra step, and so that sort of makes it a hard fork. And I don't know, like no one has ever like intentionally done a hard fork like through the whole peer review slow process. Depending on how you interpret the
maybe I just drank too much last night, but I don't think either of those are hard forks. I actually can't think of any that because a soft fork is like sort of increasing the rules and like making it stricter. And I don't think either of those.
Soft fork is shrinking the rules.
Yeah, soft fork is well, it's increasing the number of rules, shrinking the set of things that are valid. Yes. But I actually can't think of, and maybe again the drinking thing.
No, the addition of the.
But I can't think of any that were actually a hard fork, even like because you're talking about removing like opcat and stuff like that.
No, I'm talking those. He added the op-nops 0 through whatever it was 20. They didn't exist, and he added them for the specific purpose of later using them in soft forks.
Maybe that is. Yeah.
So he added what later became check template verify or whatever, or not, excuse me, now you've got me all confused. I'm talking about check lock time verify. That was added by Satoshi as a blank thing that was like a blank check. So when he added all the blank checks, it was hard, but then when we repurposed them individually, that was soft. But it doesn't make any difference because it was so long ago.
Yeah, and I think also just in terms of like this notion of like time ago, I think there's something to be said for like, if you were considering a change and we knew 2 ways of accomplishing the identical goal in terms of the effect on the system, except one had a lot more technical debt in how you might do it, one of the things that bothers me sometimes about a soft fork process is if you go through too much extra work to do the thing, you're actually signing up the rest of the future of humanity to like maintain technical debt
Yes.
forever. And like
But
it actually might not be like we might be able to swallow a small amount of governance now for saving like a bunch of complexity and potential risk in the future.
Well, let's go down that road. In what instances would you see a hard fork as not an absolute no? Like for each of you, what
Well, I agree with Jimmy that you don't want to do. See, the way it kind of played out was, for a while I thought, and I guess people agreed with me, also thought that the soft fork sort of protects us from arbitrary tyranny by the development process or something else, because you can stay on your old node and then move to the new node if you want, or stay. But then now these things have been just these ways of discovered that equivocate the hard and soft fork, these sort of modern things that make it so that they're very similar in terms of what you can do. And so the way I see it, we lose some of the protection. And then my BIP 300 is really about ending all soft and hard forks and putting them into, to some extent, so that the protocol can do an unlimited number of hard and soft forks without actually changing at all. So the protocol can have a fixed amount of code. You don't need to do any pull requests or write anything else. And I kind of feel that we should move towards the direction of not changing layer 1 Bitcoin code at all.
I'll give you a really concrete one where I think it's okay, which is if we did a soft fork that turned out to be compensatory for a user who can demonstrate that, that what they were doing, their funds got stuck, I would advocate for a hard fork to remove that rule and allow the user to get their funds out, because it was the soft fork community stole money from this person. Like, to me, that's a bad thing, and they probably should have been more vocal in that process. But if we have to patch in a hard fork to say we will allow this transaction to proceed to restore this person's funds, I think that would, at least from my perspective, like I don't love the governance around it, but that would be in the shape of the right thing to do.
Well, that would be interesting, because you're kind of assuming that an evil soft fork would go through and that you have to reverse
Not evil. So for example, if I wrote a smart contract that was like in early days of Bitcoin using opt-cat to do something, and then cat got soft forked out, which it did, and then I demonstrated, hey, look, like imagine like, I don't know, Hal Finney comes back and he's like, hey, by the way, like and he was still, around at this point, but he's like, by the way, when you did this, I couldn't advocate for myself, but I got unfrozen, and like, now I can't get to my coins because you thought, and we talk about doing these things all the time. There's this thing called, and I don't want to pick on anyone in particular, but like the great consensus cleanup, to clean up some of these really like edge condition things that we don't think anybody actually uses. But if somebody relied on that, I would want to honor the reliance interest.
So, but to push back against that, isn't that setting the same kind of precedent that was set with the DAO?
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you're saying here, because I don't think you want a hard fork for any of that stuff. If like the time to speak up is at the at the soft fork. Hey, you're going to confiscate some of my money. If you don't do that at that point, now it's like, oh, you know what? By the way, I have this thing.
So I gotcha. Didn't we just say the whole point of the soft fork was that if you don't want to be a part of whatever these people are doing, you can ignore what's going on?
Yes, but you were saying that before, but that's also the feature of it that's now like sort of fading away and it's not present.
Well, no, I didn't say that. I said it's backwards compatible.
Well, like I think part of the point of the soft fork is that like a user who, and these aren't things that are like necessarily like evil, it's just like things that we do that have an unanticipated consequence. But like if you are relying on this thing and you're not paying attention to what's happening, like this is a big deal for us developers, is that we don't want to make it feel like the community has to pay attention to what we're doing. We actually would prefer, not for like reasons of like hiding stuff, but we'd prefer if we operated in a way that most of Bitcoin doesn't have to care if we're doing something to tinker with it. But if that does happen, like I just don't, I would see if I were involved in such a thing, I feel a personal responsibility to work on restoring funds. And maybe if it's a small amount of money, you can just pay it out as like okay, sure, we'll make you whole. But I do think that it's like sort of it ruins part of the promise of soft forks if somebody can come forward later and be like, you did something that's incompatible with what I was doing, and now my funds are frozen.
I think I can reply to that by answering your question about what kind of hard fork actually would work in practice, maybe, because it doesn't make any difference what I think I might like or whatever. But I think you'd really have to get buy-in from the most important group in Bitcoin, which is the Bitcoin investor. And they are probably not technical, which means that the status quo will have an enormous amount of leverage, for lack of a better word, and you also need to make it seem as though this is in their best interest, which probably it would be almost impossible if you were saying like, well, some people lost their money somehow and we need to get it back. I would imagine it would make a lot of people nervous, and so I share your suspicion that type of a hard fork to reassign funds to people would be viewed with
it would be
with a lot of
very
hostility.
skeptical, and also like we're doing like a presumption on top of a presumption that there's a soft fork that somehow confiscates someone's funds because it was used in this very weird way. An example would be like before SegWit, somebody used the particular form, and it's okay. Now you can't redeem it because SegWit rules make it so that you can't redeem that. Like that's a very specific. Like you almost have to be pathological to have done that, and and we try to sort of like make sure that doesn't happen, and it's like such a corner case to me that I don't see this as like a thing that would realistically happen.
There is something where like in Bitcoin, we have something called like the sequence field, and usually, well, let me jump up for a second. Usually when we have one of these things like a SegWit version, we try to reserve it and make it so it's really hard to send to the network. So we're kind of communicating very clearly like, hey, you shouldn't rely on using this thing because it's for an upgrade. If you use it, like we can't guarantee what will happen. So it's kind of undefined behavior, and programmers, we all love undefined behavior, right? So that's kind of okay. Use undefined behavior, get screwed. Like that's a clear contract. But what happened is we had for end sequence, which is how you do a relative time lock in Bitcoin, we had something that was intended for future upgrades, but we forgot to do this thing where we don't let you send it to the network. And so people actually started using it. And recently I found this and I was like, hey, we actually kind of screwed up on this. We don't prevent people from broadcasting this. Is anybody using this? Because you probably like undocumented, unspecified behavior. And then we were like, okay, no one's using it, good. Maybe we can do just not even a soft fork, just a policy change to make them unbroadcastable. And then people from the Lightning Network were like, no, actually, we decided to put some extra metadata in there because we needed a memo field. And we're like, why? And they're like, oh, it's the cheapest place to put it. And we're like, okay, so now we've like kind of, and this is kind of still being debated and discussed, but like now we've maybe like permanently burned end sequence for future upgrades. And other people have been like, no, we haven't burned it. We just need to do this trick and that trick and this other trick. I'm like, I personally like, I'm not sure.
Can like a behavioral norm or a tradition become a mandatory soft fork or something?
Yeah.
It's possible. And we have 4 bytes, and every transaction has a version field that it's like, what if people started using that for something? Does that just?
We kind of do, right? I've checked.
Well, we use like 3 of the 4 billion. We use like.
Yeah, well, I guess that's where I was just saying, in this example, this is entirely something where I could imagine that if I had like, and if I weren't, maybe just like a very selfish developer, I could have been like, I noticed this thing, but I want to propose something for end sequence, and so I'm just not going to tell people about this issue. And we might have gotten pretty far down the soft fork path before anybody actually noticed that, like, hey, actually we have a hard dependency on using this. And that's an example where I just think that these things are at the limits of our capabilities as like a software community.
Well, I mean, in a sense, like you don't want to disenfranchise the people that are currently like kind of using it, and like there's no permission required. That's kind of the whole point. So if some people are using it, then it sucks as a developer because you don't have as much freedom to use certain fields or whatever. But that's kind of the burden that you have as somebody that's trying to add features that you want to add. I think that's entirely fair. It's okay that sequence field is used in a way that maybe you don't like, but it is what it is. You can't force anybody on the network. That's the fact.
So we've been discussing a lot about things that can go wrong with soft forks, implications for people, despite it being a backwards compatible mechanism. I'd like to talk a little bit about, right now we're talking about preventing bad things being put into the code, but on the other side of things, we also want to, for the time that it's still malleable enough to introduce these types of things that can give us huge improvements in Bitcoin, we still want to be able to do them. And I want to maybe dive down the road of activation methods and what we've gleaned from things like SegWit, because obviously we had some difficult time there. Things that should not have been maybe as contentious as they were became contentious. So what do you guys feel that we learned about activation methods from SegWit to start with?
Well, I don't know if like we can assign moral value, like saying it should have been easier or whatever. It was what it was, right?
Yeah.
And there's no sort of moral judgment that I think we can really cast on it. What I will say though is that what we showed was that the corporations were not in control, and that was a major event in Bitcoin history. And it's not a coincidence that Bitcoin went up in price afterwards. At least I don't think so, because we proved that the corporations don't control it. Now, what's the right way? I mean, ultimately, I'm not sure that it's like a permanent thing, right? Like, oh, 90% is the right number, and that's going to be the case for the rest of time or whatever. I think each soft fork has its own sort of environment in which it has to activate, and you have to get consensus whatever way you can for that particular soft fork with each one. And that kind of sucks for people like that are on stage with me, because they want to get something on there, and it's like, well, what's the process? Well, I hate to tell you, but there is no process. Like you just kind of have to go get consensus, and I don't know exactly what that looks like, but the burden is on you to prove to the rest of the community that this is something that's desirable.
Yeah, I can tell you, and certainly I think Jeremy will agree that it's very Kafkaesque. You're just sort of like, oh, get consensus, and it's like, oh, okay, thanks.
Earlier I said it's like kind of Groundhog Day. You come out, you see if there's shadow's there.
Is there consensus today?
But I think just kind of adding on to that, I think people really want to learn from anecdotes, and I only care to learn from data is sort of my perspective on this. And I don't think that there's any generalizable lesson out of what happened with SegWit, other than maybe corporations don't have this unilateral control. Like, 'cause if they did, we would have seen something else in this anecdote. But even that is not the most useful thing, is maybe for a less controversial, because SegWit had controversy around it. Maybe it itself wasn't as controversial, but hey, it kind of was a little bit contradictory to some miners who developed some IP around it, right? And that's maybe something that we are we fucked up. Sorry for the live streamers or whatever, but we messed up, and we don't want to. We really strive not to break anyone's mining hardware.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think it's a big egg on the face of the development community, that okay, if I wanted to learn something, it'd be we should probably have much better integration testing, that we have some way of making sure that every developer is intimately familiar with how mining hardware works, so that maybe we can avoid things like this in the future. That said, from my perspective, we're probably not going to have a lot of forks that are like SegWit, even soft forks. Most of them are much simpler. So that if you're trying to generalize a lesson from SegWit activation for check template verify, which is what I work on, it's I think most of the learnings there just don't really map. There's some stuff that maps, but it's a very different thing. It's a very different mining climate, and it's a change that is just it's not coming in to solve something that's controversial. It's something that it's in a problem space that I think most people are oh, we're going to make make the hardest money ever even harder.
Yeah.
Right. And it's okay, if we can all agree on that, we can all agree on things like self-custody. I think that those are things that just the type of thing, the lessons of oh, these things have to be really hard, and we've got to really be afraid of pissing people off. It's I'm not sure that everything goes through that same sort of gauntlet.
So, I mean, SegWit was controversial. You're saying there's not a lot of those that are likely to. We did just have a large upgrade soft fork that was not especially controversial, Taproot. And so I'm wondering if you guys, just for people watching that are unfamiliar, maybe just touch on what that enabled for us, and where that can go, and things that are still needed beyond that could be implemented later. But start with what did Taproot do for us?
Well, for me, I think it gave us a lot more privacy. So you have this mass syntax tree, and you have the single key unlock on. So you have the key spend and the script spend, and those were two different types of addresses all throughout Bitcoin's history up until Taproot. So you had the pay-to-pub key hash addresses, the addresses that start with a 1, pay-to-script hash addresses, which are the addresses that start with a 3. Even within SegWit, there was the bec32 addresses that were shorter, and then the bec32 addresses that were longer. One was pay-to-witness pub key hash, the other one was pay-to-witness script hash. You've combined those, so essentially you can't tell which one is, and in fact, all Taproot spends can be one or the other, and you have the option of both, and there's no real penalty that you're paying for that. And that gives you additional privacy, but also you have this tap tree, so you can make some very, very complicated scripts, or like have many, many different conditions under which you can unlock it, and many of them can be hidden behind many very deep in the mass tree and so on. So depending on the probability of their execution. And this gives us a lot more flexibility in sort of how we have backups to our funds and stuff like that, most of which hasn't really been adopted by wallets and so on. So I look forward to sort of seeing a lot of that. But I would say that the main benefit is that we've sort of upgraded the security for each user. So you have this ability to go and back up your wallet to 2 of 3 of this and 4 or 5 of this, and even like have public companies or something that publish their public key and have it possible for them to unlock it, and they don't even know that they hold those keys, right? Like those are some really cool things that we can have within Taproot. So I see it as like a beneficial soft fork, but to go back a little bit to what Jeremy said, and I think he's absolutely right on this. The process for SegWit and Taproot, I really don't think you can have generalized lessons. And I see that kind of as a feature, not a bug, right? Like it is frustrating for these guys, obviously, to have to go and try to find, okay, how do I get consensus? And Paul described it as Kafkaesque or whatever. It's like, how do I convince? Well, if we had like a strict process or something, that I think that would imply that we have a permanent governance model or something, right? Like, and that's exactly what we don't want. This is a decentralized network. Yes. And in a decentralized network, what you need to do is convince the people that are part of that decentralized network. Mm-hmm. And there are more people coming in and out of this decentralized network all the time. So we should expect the sort of process by which we add soft forks to be different each time, because we have more constituents, we have more use cases, we have different features, different things that are happening, and in a sense, like each soft fork has to be different because you have different people using it, and that's a good thing. I don't see that as a bad thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think that the controversy about SegWit, I think, was almost 0% about the actual SegWit part. Mm. I'm even skeptical that ASIC Boost had anything to do with it. Mm-hmm. So I totally agree with that. It's an extra layer of irony with BIP300 because what I'm sort of saying is that I can make it not, if you just give me this one thing, it won't be Kafkaesque anymore because it will be, there won't be any more changes to layer 1 Bitcoin. And if you want to do any hard or soft forks, the process is now sort of inside the BIP300 activation, which occurs without anyone changing any lines of code.
So what's the pushback to that?
Well, I think it's just a very abstract idea. I think there's a lot of like, so
I should have directed this towards
you should have directed towards them. I think part of it though is that BIP300 is about escaping Bitcoin Core to go to a different piece of software, and I think that's inherently I think that baffles people actually. People are like, but don't we have everything perfect in Bitcoin Core?
I really don't like that. Like Lightning requires external software, for example. It's like
so I think that right, it doesn't really apply, but I think that's part of what people sort of stumble over. It's also there's other features of it that are very different, or maybe like it alters who is the most important person, I think, to some extent. So that I think may have something to do with it. But I think it's also since it opens up this unlimited space of possibility, people are, the very conservative Bitcoiner is sort of trying to wonder, will one of those infinite things be really, really bad? And the answer is no, because BIP300 is designed very cleverly so that your full node is totally ignoring everything that is happening on those other networks, which is unlike the hard fork and unlike even what we thought the soft fork had that property, but it doesn't really have that property. So this is it's designed to be a big improvement on the process, but it must go, since it doesn't exist yet, it must go through the process.
Maybe instead of like
If it did,
hard
then you
fork,
could,
soft
use
fork,
it.
you
Yeah.
should rename drive chains to over easy forks.
Yeah, over easy fork. I was thinking, people were saying like, people have tried to change the terminology. I wrote a whole article about this at one point about people's changing the terminology and how the existing terminology doesn't really work because, and then there's a very funny thread between, I don't know how far we should just throw this out into like other people, but there's a Reddit thread between Adam Back and Luke Dash Jr. where they're going back and forth about whether or not something is a hard fork, and it's very funny. It's like they really don't agree, but it's because the concepts have, they don't have the properties that people thought they had, I think, when it originally was defined.
And that's something that we really haven't defined in this talk, right? Is the definition of a soft fork, and like we've thrown around terms like evil soft fork or whatever, and this is a little bit of a problem because like for some developers, like that's not a soft fork, that's actually a hard fork or something like that, and it's like these are these things matter, like they're technical minutiae that's not transparent to most users. But they matter, and this is where consensus building is especially hard. Again, I feel for these guys, right? Because it's not easy. It's really not.
Yeah. So we got about 4 minutes left. I think the last thing I'm going to lob at you guys is, what do you see as what's next coming down the pipeline, and also at what point, if ever, does Bitcoin just ossify and these conversations are moot?
I don't know.
So I guess like in ossification, it's a popular topic. People probably don't necessarily know what that means. It means the thing turns to bone. It's like you can't change it anymore, and so don't stop trying. Yeah. And it also is kind of a pun because it's like open source software. So the thing is, if you look at like societies in general through history, they have some amount of like technologically complicated product that they can produce, and it's a curve. And then when that curve starts turning the other way, so the societies usually like imminently collapse. It's just sort of a phenomenon of like, okay, there's some sort of the decline of the Roman Empire. It's like, okay, well, you look at the technologies they were producing, and I think that for this ossification, like maybe we can get Bitcoin to the point, but if we get to a point where we don't have the type of developers available who could produce the same type of artifact, I think we get ourselves into really hot water, just in terms of like Bitcoin as a society. And that's something that really concerns me. And I think one of the ways that you defray that is by keeping talent fresh that can actually work on these complicated topics and understands how Bitcoin even works. And that's something that does concern me in terms of like, is this ossification of Bitcoin going to happen? It's like, I actually think it's sort of like the demise of Bitcoin if it does, even though I think the idea of we wouldn't have to change it is appealing.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with that because I really don't think of this as technology first. I think of it as money first. And money is better when it doesn't change. And at some point, yeah, I think it'll ossify. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because you have rules that are permanently in place and you know how to plan for the future as a result of money being permanent. And that ability to plan for the future is critical to entrepreneurship, to civilization building and all that stuff. And yeah, there are sort of like technological curves. It's usually because of bad money that you get sort of like this technological fall off or something like that because you allow in a lot more rent seekers and so on. So for me, I don't see Bitcoin that way, that if we stop like soft forking or something or adding features that it suddenly like means that we're on the decline or something like that. Money that stays, that's easy to predict is a very good feature of civilization. I see that as like a stable foundation of having a civilization built on the stable foundation of money as a very good thing and which allows civilization to thrive.
I would just say, and I know we're a little on time, but like I find bugs like relatively often, and like to fix them, like I have to have a lot of specialized knowledge, and if we don't have people who are understanding how these things work, adversaries will continue to find them, and then they can take out the system over time.
Yeah,
And
fair.
that's what scares me about it.
Yeah.
I'll cede it that.
I'll leave it to Paul. You got 1 minute left.
Okay,
Final
great.
words.
I think it's a very nuanced point. I think there's some things that have ossified, like you can argue different parts of like the network, the infrastructure of the internet have they're sort of here to stay forever, warts and all, right? I mean, again, obviously I'm a proponent of this BIP 300 thing, and then ossifying. So I am concerned about exactly what you're talking about, which is that we want something reliable for the long term that is tamper resistant, basically. But I also agree with Jeremy because I do think that I don't agree that money is actually very stable across time. I mean, after all, it moved from shells to gold, and then it became banknote money. You can say whether or not you hate that, and then it's sort of becoming Bitcoin. But those are all changes, and I'm not sure that in the modern world people are very, are very.
I think in a sense,
they
like what
demand
matters
this thing.
for Bitcoin is the UTXO set.
Yeah.
And that's like ultimately the thing that matters a lot. And we can have any system that we devise around that, but it's really the property rights system that we have to maintain over time.
Awesome. I think we'll leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you
Thank you.
so much for being here. Let's give them a big round of applause.
Okay.
All right.